I'm Mike Costello, and I'm here today with Dr. Iris Freelander. And today we'd like to talk to you about forgiveness and the uniting power that it has to transform our lives. I think forgiveness is certainly something that we all talk a lot about. It's a little bit like love and other positive virtues and ideals, but the practice of it is sometimes misunderstood, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And sometimes people think they can say, I'm sorry, and that takes care of a lot of omissions. But it's a very good thing to say that we're sorry, and it's even more godly to say, I forgive you. Mm-hmm. And when we forgive someone, actually we're doing ourselves a bigger favor than we are that person, because the lack of forgiveness means that we're harboring resentment. And when we harbor any negativity, it reflects in our bodies, unfortunately, all too often.
Very important concept, and of course we spend a fair amount of time talking about the mind-body-spirit connection, and that the lack of forgiveness does, like so many emotions and so many aspects of our psychological and mental development and experience, has a direct reflection upon our physical being, doesn't it?
Yes, it does, and doctors, the medical profession, have shown that to be true. And they know that certain specific emotions might affect people in specific parts of their body. For example, they feel that women who get breast cancer very often have a very grave disappointment in their family life, and in some way. It could be in many different ways, but that's the basis of it. And I think when we know those things, then we can guard against them. But overall, we just need to forgive whatever happens in our lives. And so many people get so upset at little things, and they take exception to things that people say who don't really mean to be offensive to the person who's heard that. They are just expressing themselves in their own unique way. And I think if I would give any advice to anyone, then it would be, just like the kids used to say, shine it on. When someone says something that offends you, shine it on, unless you're really involved in an issue that needs to be resolved. And then, of course, you pay attention and you respond. But again, if we feel that emotion in our bodies, it's going to impact on our bodies. And if we harbor it for a long time, it definitely will impact adversely. And that doesn't mean that everyone who gets sick has something like that happening in their bodies, but it means that it's pretty inevitable.
That mind-body connection is a part of the disease or the disease process. But in this area of forgiveness, one of the areas that I think we should spend a little bit of time talking about is forgiving ourselves, and we need to forgive ourselves for sometimes the failings of our life. Mm-hmm. We need to forgive ourselves for some of the shortcomings of our lives. And so forgiveness, while we think of it often in terms of our relationships with others, forgiveness has a lot to do with us, doesn't it? And with our need to forgive ourselves and to let go of certain things and to move on. And I'm just thinking of people whom we've counseled over the years who have great difficulty in letting go of these hurts and negative experiences. And I think a lot of people can identify with the fact that each of us has circumstances and situations in our lives that we feel we could have acted differently, and we didn't. And so we sometimes keep beating ourselves up. And the other thing that happens, I think, and we say so often in this program, and it's so much a part of metaphysical and New Thought philosophy, is the reality that we live in our minds. And so as we relive these experiences, they become more powerful and they become more potent. And in the power and the increased potency of them, we begin to feel bitter and angry at ourselves because of the things that perhaps we didn't do, or things that we did do that we shouldn't have done. And so forgiving ourselves is a very important aspect, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And I think that's happening a lot today with parents and with other relationships. if we're responsible for someone else's well-being, then we think, and it must be something that's going on that's part of the mass consciousness for our spiritual growth. And perhaps it's something that needs to happen. I don't know, but I don't know if you've observed that, but so many people are wishing they had done differently with their children and looking back in their lives and thinking that they did something wrong with the ones for whom they were responsible. So I would say that, and I might fall in that same category, because I said to my oldest son once, I think I need to hear you say, I forgive you for having not met his needs at a specific point. It would be too long to go into that specific point, but it was something in our personal lives. And he said, well, there's nothing to forgive. You did the best you could. And so then I went back in the house and I thought about it, and then I went back out and I said, what I need to hear you say was that you forgive me. Well, actually, it was after the death. I was reviewing after the death of my daughter, his sister, and it occurred to me when I was reading something that I hadn't addressed my son's needs the way I should have when his sister died. And that's when I went out and asked him to forgive me. And so he said, you did the best you could. And so then when I went back out and said, you didn't say what I really needed to hear. He said, I forgive you. And then he mumbled, there's really nothing to forgive. But I forgive you. So I think a lot of us are looking back, and it might be there's a consciousness shift at this time that humankind is undergoing and the earth is undergoing a certain shift. And so it might be due to that. But sometimes we're prompted to need to ask for forgiveness, and it's something that's not resolved, and we need to go back in time and bring that forth. And don't you think so?
I think that's absolutely true. And sometimes we need help to do that.
Yes.
And sometimes we can do it ourselves. Sometimes we can do it in meditation or reflection. And it really depends upon how deeply that need for healing is. And of course, what we're talking about is healing, isn't
Yes.
it? And the aspect of healing, the topic today, forgiveness, unites us. And I think the wonderful thing about that little snippet of a topic is that the human and spiritual dimensions unite us in that we're all so much the same. And so often we believe that we're a terrible parent, or we're a good parent, or we're a terrible employee or a good employee. We make these judgments about ourselves on all different levels of our life. And in fact, we are all the same. And that you touched upon something that I think is tremendously important. And we talk about it a lot at the center, and you and I talk to our clients in counseling about it, and that is shifting our consciousness. And a shifting consciousness is simply a more structured way of, or a more clinical way of saying, change your mind, change your way of thinking. And if we change our way of thinking about our behavior, our past behavior, our past performance, our past relationships, then we shift. And many people are able, especially with the help of counseling, and whether it's with the help of psychological help or with spiritual counseling or just reflection, are able to see times in their lives when they made a cataclysmic or a monumental shift, when that really happened. And it's like the awe experience, the light bulb goes on, and we begin to see that it was really something going on in us, and it had to do with us, and it had to do with our relationship with ourselves and our relationship with those around us. And we do have relationships with ourselves, and so often that kind of dissociation issue is a big one. And so we need to really understand that we are united and that we are the same. We are physical beings, we're spiritual beings, we're mental beings. And another thing that you touched on that I think is just wonderful, we need 2 or 3 hours to talk about this, but is that everybody really at their core is doing the best they can. You and I and everyone else is doing the best they can. Now, we may not perform to our highest and our best and to the expectations that we've set or others have set for us. But I think it is rare that people actually go out seeking not to to do that which
Yes.
they would want to do.
Yes, yes, and sometimes we're misunderstood, and sometimes we misunderstand the point ourselves. And very often we forget that there is a divine purpose in each person's life. And before we're born, we have, some call it sacred contracts, some call it various names, but we all have things that we came in to accomplish into that earth life. And so when we're on target, we're feeling very comfortable with ourselves. But then other people might not feel comfortable with it, and they would question it, and then it creates a question in our minds. So in other words, when we see something that we're unhappy with in our own actions or someone else, we need to look at the broader aspect there, not just the moment at hand, because the moment at hand just shows us what's happening in that given time. But there's an overall plan to everyone's life, and we don't know what they came in to accomplish. And so we can be more broad in our thinking, and it also would then add reasons in our minds for people acting the way they do, when we can't fathom sometimes why anyone would act the way they do. And I know just very recently a lady's feelings was quite hurt. She was quite offended because of something someone said who really was just trying to make conversation in his way. So people will make conversation from their frame of reference, each in their own individual way, and then another person might take gross exception to that, and it might be very offensive to them. And sometimes we just forget and say the wrong thing, not meaning to offend anyone, and I'm sure that's happened to all of us. But again, we can just consider that that person didn't mean it in a hurtful way.
Mm-hmm. And begin the process of letting go
Yes.
of it instead of holding on to it. We want to hold on to it so hard. We want to hold on to it. And so often we want to hold on to it and have ourselves be punished, or we want others to be punished.
Others to be punished. Very often we think they need to be punished. They need to be told, why should they do that? And why should they get by with it? Because it's just I suppose that's the way we're all made. But we do ourselves the biggest favor. I think I said that earlier. It helps us more than it helps anyone else when we don't bear grudges and when we just let things go, let things slide by, and just think, well, I wonder what they meant by that, but they must know I don't, and take it on from there, because we try, those of us who try to live a spiritual life, well, there's nothing more spiritually oriented than to be forgiving of other people, and to not look for grossness in other people, but to just take it for granted that everyone is wonderful, and no one is trying to hurt us.
That's key. Tremendously important to believe that others are not trying to hurt us and to not allow them to hurt us. But then, of course, when we do get hurt, to understand that that's a part of the human and the spiritual process, and let that be and work through that experience. We'd like to pause at this point in the program and offer you the opportunity to receive some literature so that you can continue to study the ideas and concepts we're sharing with you.
Like to offer you the opportunity to receive one of these free booklets to further your understanding of the new thought message of confident living. Each month we will feature a different booklet, which will be mailed to you free and postage paid. Simply address your request to Confident Living at P.O. Box 7726, Long Beach, California, 90807.
In the second half of the program, I think we need to talk a little bit about letting go. We're great, not Iris and Mike, although we're good at it too, of holding on to things. We hold on to the securities that we have. We hold on, in some cases, to the negatives and to the positives, but so often to the negatives. And we judge, and we judge by appearances. And of course, one of the things that we talked about in the first half of the program that's so fundamental to our way of thinking and to our philosophy is not judging by appearances, but seeing beyond the appearance to that which really is true, and also not trying to analyze everything to death. We want to know everything, and we want to know the whys and the wherefores, and we want to know why people behave in a certain way, or why they've said this, or why they haven't. And in some cases we can get an answer, in other cases we can't. But life is really more fulfilling and more empowering as we let go and move and allow it to flow, isn't it?
Yes, and when we allow life to flow, we are happiest, very much so, at our very best. And when we allow other people to be themselves and express themselves, then very often, if it's necessary, we can have a dialogue, but to not be upset about it. It's just like we're going on the modality of, well, I wonder what they really meant. And then you can have a really interesting conversation. But when we look for trouble, then we find trouble. But when we don't, another thing, we're all one. We're all part of Creator God. And when we look at life in that way, it changes our attitude toward other people. Because we realize, and I know a lot of people say there, but for the grace of God go I. Well, we can always look at other people in that way too. And very often we might have offended others far more than that person is being offensive. So, and whoever heard us say unpleasant things, just let it ride. So we can look to all of life as being, we're all one, we're all created equal under God, and we are co-creators with Creator God. And God gave us free will. So when we exercise our free will in a negative way or in a hateful, hurtful way, then we're hurting everyone but ourselves most of all.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And when we behave as though we're only human beings, and how often do we hear that? I can't forgive because he or she said that I'm only human, I'm only human. Well, that's an interesting concept and idea, but we are more than only human. And because we are more than human, we are united as children of the Creator and as children of the universe. And so we come from many backgrounds, we come from many experiences, we come from many different areas, and we've all had different things happen to us and within us. And because of that, we need to remind ourselves that we're not only human, and that there is a dimension of ourselves that transcends the human aspect, and there is a dimension of others which transcends the human aspect. And we need to connect with that truth and that reality and understand that people, as you said, and as we've been talking in this half hour, are going to behave the way they behave. And so often we can do something about it by interceding or understanding, but in many cases we're not going to. And it never, ever, ever hurts or does any harm to let go of whatever it is that's negative or hurtful, and to forgive in a uniting sense and overlook it. And also, I think it's important that we touch on the fact that as we forgive, it doesn't mean that we have given our assent or blessing to that circumstance. It simply means that we've moved on and that we're not allowing it to damage us anymore. And therein, I think, lies a great spiritual and material lesson, and that is that we damage ourselves, both materially, physically, I mean physically, and spiritually and psychologically, that we damage ourselves as little as possible, and that we damage others as little as possible. And that has to do with having a loving state of consciousness, having a willingness to forgive and overlook, and understanding this unity of consciousness, this united thought, and this united relationship that we all have on this little planet. And it is a little planet, and it's getting smaller and smaller. And because it's getting smaller and smaller, it calls us, the reality calls us to be bigger and bigger in our forgiveness, in our unity, in our oneness, in our openness, and in our acceptance. And in so doing, we need to be conscious always that we do as little damage as possible. Now, we're going to damage people. There's no question about it. We're going to damage our children, and we're going to damage ourselves physically and psychologically and spiritually, but to damage each other as little as possible. That's key. And so many people are damaged in such horrible and unspeakable ways, and that causes them to behave in a certain way, in unspeakable ways, and it causes them to act in those ways. And we need to understand that about others, and we need to understand that about ourselves.
Yes, and then we have to understand when others are acting terrible, they probably are justifying their own feelings. And I think that happens so often when people will think they're justified in doing that because someone did such and such. And that's not only on a personal level, but it's on a national level and international level, that we go to war on that very same principle, don't we?
We do. And we go to war in our personal lives,
Yeah.
in our family lives. I mean, you know, we think globally in today's environment, and that's wonderful. But, and certainly there are a lot of things we can do globally, but we go to war in our households.
Yeah.
We go to war in our families, in our relationships. We go to war in our churches. We go to war in every relationship that we have. And we need to be cautious about that and understand that when we that the warring perhaps should stop. And the warring is not going to stop on a global basis until the warring stops on a personal and an internal basis. And we begin with our circle. We begin with our family and our relationship and our church and our workplace and our friends. That's where we begin to make changes. And those changes begin to be made on a personal level, and then the globe changes and the universe changes. Somehow we've decided we can change the universe first. and of course that's not going to happen until that change and transformation comes about at the personal level.
That's right. And when each person changes, then we have overall peace and contentment and harmony in life. And I saw a movie recently where the mother in the family was so sanctimonious that she thought everything she said was the right thing to say. And it was that movie about Schmidt, and it was, she had been married 2 times, and she said, I've had 2 husbands and neither were worth anything. And one was present at a dinner, and she was so rude, unspeakably rude to him. And she spoke to him in a vulgar way, she spoke to him in a disrespectful way, any negativity, you name it. But that's what happens too often. People think they know everything and they're right, and so then they put other people down, thinking it elevates them, and it never does. But we can learn a lot from just observing what happens in life. But again, I think the most important aspect in this part of our discussion is that we need to respect every person and respect and find peace within ourselves. When we do, it makes a difference in the world. It makes all the difference in the world. And when everyone is doing that on a global level, then we'll truly be into the time of the golden time of life, and we'll be in heaven on earth.
Mm-hmm. And of course, that heavenly state of consciousness can come about anytime we choose. And so it is a process of mind and a process of emotion and a process of action as well. And before time gets away from us, we do want to touch on the fact, as we always do and I always do in my talks, is people need to feel the way they feel. If they feel that way, let them feel that way. That's all right. But then they don't need to continue to feel that way. And if they choose to continue to feel that way, then we need to be willing to bless them and release them and let them go and forgive them.
Yes, and to ask for forgiveness. And it doesn't hurt us to say, I'm sorry you feel that way. I don't understand it, but I'm sorry. And we're not putting ourselves down. We're just making the other person realize, well, we're not holding dominance there.
Mm-hmm. That part of letting go and letting things be, and we just have this need to express ourselves and control everything. And of course, as we let go of the need to control, we find that good and wonderful things begin to happen, and that all things are moving in a positive and affirmative way. Maybe not the way we want them to, but they're thank goodness. But also our lives as well. So we need to let things just be, let them be, and be willing to let go. And that's what the aspect of forgiveness, I think, is letting go. Letting go of judgment, letting go of intolerance, letting go of the need to punish, and the need to punish ourselves.
Yeah. And the need to be right. Because sometimes there is no right or wrong. It's a matter of opinion. And so each person feels that they're right. Well, we shouldn't entertain that need, because what are we proving anyway?
And that is actually continuing to validate our unforgiveness, which then validates and strengthens our divisions instead of the uniting power of forgiveness. And of course, uniting ourselves is what we're talking about doing today. We're talking about uniting ourselves through a spirit and a consciousness and awareness of forgiveness.
Yeah, and our forgiveness shouldn't just be words either. We shouldn't just think that saying the words, like some people say, I'm sorry, and they say it, I see that in small children a lot, where they say, I'm sorry, and then they turn around and do the very same thing. Well, we don't need to be like that. When we say, I'm sorry, or I forgive you, then we need to really mean it, and have it show in our body language and our tone of voice, and in our future relationship. Because it's not a virtue to say I forgive you if we're not really forgiving. And some people take great pride in never forgiving. I've heard people say that. I never forgive and I never forget.
And then the consequences are their own, and we bless them and we release them, and we hope that they'll come and talk to us so that we can help to share the ideas and concepts that we're sharing with them. And we hope that the idea of forgiveness and uniting ourselves with all people is appealing to you, and that you found this information to be useful, and we look forward to seeing you next time.